Good to everybody else.
Very good.
Okay, great. Well, let's jump in. Okay. Tonight, we're going to talk about a period of time even more turbulent than the one we're living through, if that can be imagined. Okay. We're going to talk about a group of Scots who came to New England by force, the Scottish prisoners of 1650 and 51. Now, I don't know the stories of all of these Scottish prisoners, but my book, The Involuntary American, A Scottish Prisoner's Journey to the New World, discusses what life was like for a few of them. And in researching their lives, I gained a new perspective on early Maine and early New England society. So I'd like to share some of that with you tonight. I think you're probably all familiar with New England's founding narrative. I'm guessing that many of us were taught that the Pilgrims were chased out of England and because of the way they worshiped. And they went all over and they finally ended up in New England and they found religious freedom here and everyone was happy, right? I have to tell you that the story I'm going to tell you tonight is a little different from that one. In fact, it's in many ways the inverse of that one. So this is a bit of revisionist history, okay? I know there are a lot of descendants out there. I wish I could see a show of hands, but I'll tell you that I've given this talk throughout New England maybe a dozen times. Every time I've given it, there's at least a handful of descendants in the audience. And I've been contacted by people from, you know, Canada and Utah and California and Georgia and Texas. The DNA of these 422 individuals is truly scattered throughout the Americas, right? So it's a very interesting thing for me. Let's start with the big picture though. I want you to look at this image. And this is how the ports of the Atlantic Basin in the 1600s and 1700s, with ships and people and goods being constantly transported back and forth among Europe, Africa, and the Americas, okay? This is really the zenith of the first global age, okay? So we talk about living in a global age now. Well, this is the beginning, okay? And even if communication was a lot slower then, there was a lot of it going on. There was a lot of immigration, a lot of commerce, just a lot of movement in general. Okay, so that's just sort of the big picture that I want you to keep in mind. Okay, having some issues here with. I'm having some issues. Let's see. For some reason, I can't. I'll have to stop the share, I guess, and let's see if I can. Yeah, let's see if I can. Yeah, this isn't working out. Let's see. Let's try this. Usually this goes pretty well, everybody, so please be patient, but I'm having some difficulty finding the. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. So in 1650, 150 Scottish prisoners from the Battle of Dunbar arrived in Boston. Okay. And in 1651, 272 additional Scottish prisoners from the Battle of Worcester arrived in Boston. Now, most of these men were sold for 20 to 30 pounds each, but we do know that 62 became property of an iron foundry. So I'll give you a little background on the battles of Dunbar and Worcester. If you don't know much about them, they were decisive battles in what we call the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. Now, the Three Kingdoms were England, Scotland, and Ireland. These conflicts are sometimes called the English Civil Wars, but that is really kind of inaccurate because, as I said, even if the Three Kingdoms were under a single ruler, as they were, Charles I, they were still distinct, okay? And so, for example, Ireland was mostly Catholic. Scotland was Presbyterian with some Catholics in the Highlands. And in England, the Anglicans and the Puritans were struggling for supremacy. Now, Charles was not well liked among most of these groups, okay? He couldn't get control of them. In fact, Parliament and Scotland had joined together to fight against Charles I, okay? And so they really didn't like him. But at some point he said, I have to get control of these disparate groups. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to have everybody worship the same as me. Everybody's going to become an Anglican, okay? And that way they'll all treat me with more respect. Well, this, of course, made everybody angry except the Anglicans, okay? So, so in 1649, Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan military leader and a powerful member of Parliament, had King Charles I beheaded, and he seized control of the government. This is the period we call the interregnum, the period between kings, right? Now, the Scots were livid because nobody had asked their permission. They had fought alongside Cromwell against the king, but nobody had asked their permission to have the king beheaded and to have Cromwell, the Puritan, seize control, not only of England, but also of Scotland, okay? And after all, Charles I was a Stuart king. He was from the Scottish line. So the Scots mustered large armies to fight Cromwell. They were very upset, and they tried to reinstall the king's son, Charles II, and Presbyterianism as the predominant religion in Scotland and England. You can see that people took their religion very, very seriously at this period of time. Now, Cromwell won both battles at Dunbar and Worcester. So this is, making a long story short, he won both of these battles. He captured huge numbers of Scottish prisoners. He captured as many as 10,000 men at each battle, right? So he's got 20,000 young, strapping Scotsmen on his hands. What is he going to do with them? Well, actually, the wounded ones he did set free. But the others, he knew that if he did, they were going to grab their weapons and come right back. So he did not set them free. In fact, he had them shipped away, okay? And he shipped them to places including England, France, Barbados, and New England. And those sent to America were either sold or conveyed as property. So what we're looking at here is a case of individuals being sent to New England against their wills because of religion, okay? So there was very, very little religious freedom in this event, all right. Now you might think that shipping 2 boatloads of prisoners to New England to be sold at Boston was a rare occurrence. It wasn't, okay? Many, many individuals came to New England against their wills in the 17th century. And I want to look at that just for a minute so that we can see these Scottish prisoners in their historical context. So early in the century, there's a council for New England, okay, which is an advisory council to the king on New England. And it urged him to order magistrates across the country to send, quote, the poorer sort of people to New England. Okay. Now, despite what you may think, this does not mean they entice them with free meals and free nights in local hotels. Okay. It means they rounded them up against their wills and they shipped them abroad in the holds of ships as laborers. Okay. And the rationale for doing so, you have to look at this. This is the second sentence here. It will thereby disburden the commonwealth of a multitude of poor that are likely daily to increase to the infinite trouble and prejudice of the public state. Okay, so that's their way of coping with these poor people that they're saying are being such a drag on the public state. Okay, ship them away, right? It lacks a little bit of compassion in my humble opinion, but anyway. England wasn't the only place doing this. As you can see in the second paragraph that I've given you, magistrates in Edinburgh petitioned to send petty criminals away, okay? And not just send them away, but with the first conveniency, right? So get them out of here as quickly as possible, right? Now, what's particularly sad, I think, is that children were a large part of this trend. In his journal, John Winthrop, who's the founder and governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, writes about 20 unaccompanied children arriving in Massachusetts, as he says, quote, with many more to come after. Now, as you can imagine, these children are mostly orphans or they're from indigent families, and they also became laborers in New England. There was such a need for servants and laborers at this time that the trade in servants became a profitable enterprise. Kidnapping rings developed in the British Isles during the 17th century. So cities like London and Bristol and Aberdeen had very active kidnapping rings, okay, where they're grabbing people and shipping them away. What's particularly sad about this case of this ship is that Winthrop in his journal follows one of these children, a young boy named Nathaniel Sewell, and the trial of Nathaniel Sewell's master, who was found guilty of causing the boy's death through harsh treatment. So it's not an easy go, right? Now, Africans were also part of this trend. And this is the receipt for sale of a young Black girl named Lucy to a man in Boston named Robert Sharp. Now, this receipt is from 1745, which is about 100 years after what we're really talking about. Nevertheless, there were plenty of African slaves in New England in the 17th century. And we know for sure that one of the first men to own slaves was a man called Samuel Maverick. And he lived on Nautilus Island in Boston Harbor. And he had slaves there as early as 1638. Now, you might not know where Nautilus Island is, but I bet you a lot of you have been there, okay? It's exactly where Logan Airport sits today. So as you fly in and out of Logan Airport, I want you to remember, that's the spot where some of the first African slaves lived in New England. So Samuel Maverick was not the only person to own African slaves. Massachusetts Bay Governor Simon Bradstreet, husband of poet Anne Bradstreet, he did hold slaves. Cotton Mather, who's a prolific clergyman and chronicler of early New England, received an African slave as a gift from his congregation. So you can see where slavery stood in the eyes of the very pious, even the very pious Puritans. Maine and New Hampshire also had their share of African slaves. The Shapley and Pepperell families of Kittery, Captain Brian Pendleton of Saco, and the influential Cutts family of Maine and New Hampshire, they all held African slaves in the mid-1600s. And some of you may have read Patricia Wall's book, Lives of Consequence, Blacks in Early Kittery and Berwick. That's an interesting book, and she goes into more detail certainly than I will. And it's important for me to note at this point that Africans had a very different experience from other kidnapped individuals. So I've heard of our Scottish prisoners being referred to as slaves, and I think it's inaccurate, and I'll tell you why. Because most Africans became slaves for life. And in many cases, their children automatically upon being born became property of their masters. Okay, that simply wasn't the case for any European individuals that I'm aware of. In most cases, white individuals like our Scottish prisoners had finite terms of servitude, so 6, 7, or 8 years, right? And they were prohibited from marrying while they were servants. But if they did have children, and some did have children out of wedlock, those children were born free. Okay, so again, that's just something to keep in mind. And here are some statistics of other soldiers and combatants that were shipped over here to the New World. We have our 422 soldiers. Those are the ones we're talking about tonight at the top. But an additional 1,300 captives from the Battle of Worcester were transported to Barbados at about the same time. Later in the century, 277 participants in Argyll's Rising were sent to Jamaica and New Jersey. Okay. What you may not have known is that as many as 1,000 Native American combatants were shipped away from New England after the Pequot and King Philip's Wars. And they were shipped to places like the Caribbean and Madeira. And yes, they were shipped as servants, okay? So what's going on? Well, it turns out that governments everywhere were engaged in what we call a form of social engineering, and that is moving populations around to solve social problems. And so our Scottish prisoners were just part of that larger trend. So now let's get a little closer to the bone here and get into more detail about what life was like for these prisoners once they did arrive in New England. And they arrived in winter, so that's why I have this picture. Hammersmith Iron Works, located in Saugus, Massachusetts, is one of the earliest industrial sites in North America. Now, iron, as you can imagine, was really important at the time. They use it for everything, for pots, tools, weapons, hardware, right? And before Hammersmith was established in the 1640s, all those items had to be imported from Europe. which meant they were really expensive. Okay. So you'll see here that 62 of the Dunbar Scots became property of the iron foundries at Saugus and Braintree. They were the same company, but two different campuses. Okay. And boy, I think the industrialists were really happy to have these guys because there wasn't, as I say, a lot of available labor around in New England. Now, this image is the Saugus Ironworks Historic Site. Maybe some of you visited it. And it's a reconstructed replica of the original campus on the Saugus River, where these 62 or many of the 62 Scots ended up. And as I said, it would have been winter when they arrived. So what would they have done? Well, immediately they would have been put to work felling large numbers of trees, cutting and curing the wood, making charcoal for the ironworks furnaces, right? And in summer, they would mine the ore by digging into sodden, marshy earth and extracting it. You can see in the foreground, this is the Saugus River, and it's surrounded by very marshy earth. And these guys, so they'd be up to their waists in this muck, extracting with shovels the ore. And this is very heavy and unpleasant work. And it's exactly what they were brought to New England to do. They did receive, as I say, meals, clothing, and shelter. Okay. They lived together, we know this, two to a bed in large bunkhouses. Probably they built the bunkhouses themselves. So they were two in a bed and they lived in these, like large dormitories. They were given food. I've given you some indication on the left here of things that were ordered for them. And because you can still see the ironworks papers, they still exist and they're actually at Harvard's Baker Library. The fact is that they probably ate better in New England than they had in a long, long time. Okay, we know as prisoners of war, and some of this may be available to you through the old Berwick exhibit, but as prisoners of war, they had been marched from Dunbar in Scotland to Durham in England, which is a distance of about 100 miles. And they had been given no food nor any water throughout that entire march. In fact, they're a little ways into the march, perhaps 30 miles or so, a group of Scots sat down on the ground and said, "We are going no further until you give us something to eat or drink." Those Scots were shot on the spot, and the others were forced to continue. We also know, records tell us that these Scots fasted for at least a day or two or three before the battle, because that was how they prepared themselves to get ready for the battle. So while they're in this horrible march down to Durham, there's nothing to eat, nothing to drink. They're drinking from mud puddles. They're dying along the side of the road of dysentery and malnutrition, etc. It was a horrible situation. So the ones that made it to New England were extraordinarily lucky in some sense. The truth also is that they were raised during very lean times in Scotland, okay, during some of the worst famines and droughts in the country's history. This was the period of the Little Ice Age, and you may have heard of that. It's a period of very extreme weather, inundations and droughts, and crops were spoiled. And so in the bones of the individuals that were actually excavated at Durham Cathedral, where they were buried, some of them who died, the archaeologists at Durham University have found widespread evidence of nutritional diseases from very early ages, rickets and scurvy and all kinds of things. So getting to New England, being fed these kinds of things at Saugus probably was a bright spot for them, I think, in some ways. So, and there's no indication that while they were there, they were used particularly cruelly, okay? But we have to factor in the idea that they've been forced into exile 3,000 miles away from home, away from their families and native land. And, they were considered property of the company. So Saugus wasn't the only place where many of these Scots ended up. There were quite a few who ended up at sawmills in Piscataqua. And I'd like you to think of Piscataqua not so much as the river that we all know separates Maine from New Hampshire, but as a region. It's the region on both sides of that river. It includes Berwick. And in fact, as you look at this map and you see the river and you see its tributaries, I'd like you to think of those as less of a separation between communities and more of a system of highways, because that's how they got around. There really were no good roads at the time. There were a few paths and a few roads, but they were horrible. And so most people would have gotten around, most of the communication would have been by boat, right? Now we know at Squamscott, which is Exeter, New Hampshire, 7 to 8 Scottish prisoners were purchased by a man named Nicholas Lisson for his sawmill. Now Lisson, we think, was himself a Scottish Presbyterian, but he emigrated voluntarily as early as, I think, 1637, perhaps, okay? What's interesting, all 3 of his daughters, he had 3 daughters, and they ended up marrying his Scottish servants that he purchased from the battles of Dunbar and Worcester. So he's really getting a twofer, right? He's getting workers for his sawmill and he's getting husbands for him. Then was John Bean, or John MacBean, and he married Hannah Lisson. And the reason I point out those 2 is because we think they're the original American ancestors of L.L. Bean. Okay, but what's really interesting in that in his daughters marrying with his servants is it suggests to me that Scots, regardless of class, stuck together and supported one another. And indeed, you're going to see a lot of examples of that throughout this presentation. Now at Oyster River, which is present-day Durham, New Hampshire, where the university is, as many as 18 Scottish prisoners ended up at Valentine Hill's sawmill. Now, Valentine Hill was not a Scot. He was a well-connected Puritan merchant. And Thomas Doughty, the main character of my book, was purchased by Valentine Hill. Now, from 15 to 25 Scottish prisoners worked at the Great Works sawmill at Newickawannock, which is obviously South Berwick, Maine. And it was a huge 20-saw operation. And you'll note also that Newickawannock is called Unity Parish. And that's after the ship Unity that brought the Dunbar Scots to New England. Now, there were other sites. I think there were individual or a couple of Scots that were sold to various farms and workshops, like by either 1 at a time or 2 at a time. But what I'm trying to give you is the sort of the larger communities of where they ended up. Now, in Piscataqua, of course, the Scots were also engaged in physical labor. In winter, they would cut trees by hand using saws and axes and haul them from the woods with teams of oxen. And in spring and summer, they'd transport those logs downstream to sawmills for processing and shipment. It's dangerous and grueling work. And even now that it's mechanized, it's very dangerous, but try to imagine hauling these enormous logs over icy slopes with oxen. It had to be really, really tough. We know of 2 Scottish prisoners who died from having tree limbs fall on them, James Murray and Thomas Canada. And we know of 2 more who died from drowning while floating these logs downstream. So lumber mills were as important, obviously, as foundries, maybe even more so, to the settlement of New England and the other American colonies. You probably know that some of our timber was sent abroad to England, right, for masts and stuff. But a lot of it went to the Caribbean colonies because they had run through their forests very quickly. And a lot of it stayed here in New England. Why? Because it was used for everything. It was used for building homes, mills, meeting houses. It was the fuel for heating and cooking, okay? And it was even used for currency. In fact, wood lumber was more common as currency in 1650 than were English pounds here on the New England frontier. And you'll see court cases being settled by saying, well, Thomas Doughty owes so-and-so so many board feet, or Peter Grant owes somebody else so many pipe staves. So they really were using it as a form of currency. Now, the quote that I've given you is from William Hubbard, and he's a kind of a historian and a clergyman, Puritan clergyman. And so this is about 20 odd years after the Scots arrived. And he says the area was booming with sawmills by that time, okay? He says that there was at least 1 sawmill in every river and stream along the coast. And I'm going to go back just for a minute because I'll give you an example. Between Exeter, New Hampshire, and York, Maine is a distance of about 25 miles. Okay? We know that in the 1670s, there were 15 sawmills just within that distance. Between York and Casco Bay, Maine, there had to have been at least a dozen more. I can't tell you exactly how many. But what does this mean? What it means is the virgin forests were disappearing fast, okay? And you have to put yourselves in the shoes of the Native Americans, right? This had to be extremely alarming to see the forest being chewed up in this really systematic fashion by these sawmills. So for the most part, while they're servants, these men are pretty silent in the court cases, for the most part, I say. And that means that, you know, they probably were under pretty tight rein. But this is an example of somebody who got into trouble, and he does appear in the court records. Alexander Maxwell, or Maxwell is his name, right? And he was a Dunbar prisoner of war. And he'd had a disagreement with his master there in South Berwick at the Great Works Sawmill. And he was publicly whipped. You can see 30 lashes were given him upon the bare skin. He was thrown in jail, and he was forced to compensate his master for time away from work and his board while he was in jail. Okay, so everything he ate, he had to compensate his master. His master had to pay for it, and he had to pay him back. Okay, and the threat for committing a second offense was that he could be sold to Virginia or Barbados or any of the other English plantations. So to really understand this threat, you know, you have to imagine what would it be like to be sold to Barbados, for example. And you would say to yourself, as a 21st century inhabitant, you would say, oh, great. You know, it's a resort, right? So I'd be happy to go there. Let me tell you something. In the 17th century, it was anything but a resort, okay? It was sheer hell on earth, okay? And the reason was, it was the center of English sugar production. So there were sugar plantations, and they ran through servants like water. It was hot, tropical diseases ran rampant, and the servant culture was just much more brutal than it was in New England. So you did not want to be sold there, okay? I think the good news here is that Maxwell survived this controversy, and he gained his freedom around 1657. So I'll let you ponder on that for a second while I have a drink of water. Like Maxwell, after 6 or 7 or 8 years of labor, the Scottish prisoners were set free. So what did they do? Well, to me, the most interesting fact is that we don't know of a single one of the 422 who returned home. It's kind of amazing when you think about it. What some of them did do in Boston in January of 1657, they founded this organization, the Scots Charitable Society. Now, this was founded by 28 Scots. I don't think all of them were former prisoners, but I think a good number were. And this organization was founded just as they were emerging from their terms of servitude. And they didn't have families, and they didn't have other community supports. So they feared for their welfare in their new country, right? So they said, well, what are we going to do? They got together. They took small amounts of money. They said, let's take 1 or 2 pence every month and put it into a kitty, okay? And then we'll decide as a group who needs it the most. Now, some of the records of this organization still exist too, so we know how they spent this money. And money was often given for burial fees for indigent Scots, people who couldn't afford to bury themselves. It was also given to widows, right? Because if you're a widow in 17th century New England, you have a very hard time. It's really a very, very difficult thing. What's amazing is that this organization still exists today, and it's the oldest ongoing charitable organization in North America. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is that these prisoners left behind more than their DNA. They also left behind their institutions. So continuing with this notion of what happened once they were given their freedom here, this is a quote from the Massachusetts Body of Liberties of 1641. And you have to think of this as a sort of constitution for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And it dictated that servants, upon finishing their terms of servitude, shall not be sent away empty. Okay? This means that you can't, when a fellow is finished working for you, you can't just say goodbye and good luck, right? You have to offer him something for the years that he's given you. So a lot of these Scottish prisoners received land grants. And this is revolutionary, because had they remained in Scotland, it would have been virtually impossible for any of them to acquire their own land. The land in Scotland was held by lairds and clan chiefs, and it simply wasn't available for the average individual. Now, the question I have is, did the English truly have the right to grant lands to their former servants? And this is the point where we have to remember that all of New England, including where I'm standing and many of you are sitting right now, was indigenous land. And the English had a motive for granting parcels to British subjects. Okay, let's think about it. Let's imagine that you're a wealthy merchant or the wife of a wealthy merchant, and you live in Boston or Salem, and you give a former servant a parcel of land in an outlying area. Now, you know this is the best opportunity he's going to get in his entire lifetime, right? So he's going to defend that property with everything he's got. And what does that mean for you? Well, it means he's your gatekeeper and sentry guard, right? It makes you all the more secure, okay? So the more English subjects we have settling in our neighborhood, the safer we'll be, right? Now, this slide merely is to show you that there were Scots both in Oyster River and there in South Berwick at Unity Parish who received land grants from their masters and sometimes from the town, actually. So I think what's really important here is also, well, Thomas Doughty was actually an exception to this. Okay, he did not receive a grant of land. He received a sum of money from Valentine Hill when he was finished with his servitude. And what did he use that sum of money for? He did not purchase a passage back to Scotland. He took the money and immediately purchased land on the Oyster River across from his master. Okay, so I guess what I'm trying to get at is that land is an extremely important reason for people coming to New England. And for the Scots, I think it's extremely important for their staying here, and at least as important, if not more so, than religious freedom. I think, early in the 17th century, the English arrive on ships, right? And they look out, and what do they see? They see forests. And their thinking is, oh, look at all of this vacant land. Think of what we could do with this, okay? Now, of course, the land wasn't vacant, right? It was land that Native Americans had used for generations. And so there start to be two visions for how this land is going to be used, and they're really conflicting visions. The European vision involves individual ownership, leveled forests, fenced-in farms, mills, dams, and permanent settlements, very much like the way we live today. The Native American vision was very different. It involved intact woods for hunting habitat, open agricultural fields. So they did clear fields for agriculture, but they were open and very rarely fenced or anything like that. Open rivers to allow migrating fish. Seasonal settlements, you probably know that natives would go inland in winter for hunting, and then in spring and summer they go to the shore or offshore for fishing and gathering shellfish. But most important of all, they had a more communal sense of ownership. They did believe that the land was theirs. They did defend it as theirs, okay? But it wasn't as though it was individual owners, like, Madakawando, this is Madakawando's plot, or this is Squando's plot, right? That wasn't what they did. It was like our land. It was like the community's land, okay? So these two visions, the European and the Native American vision for the land, are going to cause problems. Now, while many of the Scots farmed the land that they received, Thomas Doughty, who had trained as a lumberman under Valentine Hill, didn't. He actually cut the timber, he sold it to local sawmills, and then he sold the cleared land as farmland. And because the forests were disappearing so fast in Piscataqua, which we've already talked about, Doughty then moved north into Maine, looking for other opportunities. Okay? And he first moved to North Berwick, where he built a dam. And then he moved north to Saco, which is present day, the part of Saco that is present day Biddeford, actually. Now, the Scots, once they were free, they formed tight-knit communities here on the frontier. As many as 25 Scots settled at Unity Parish, where they received land grants, etc. An area in nearby York came to be called Scotland because of the number of prisoners who settled there. And the Scots also settled at Kittery, Wells, and Saco in Maine, and Exeter and Oyster River, New Hampshire. And they didn't settle alone. They settled in groups. And in fact, many Scots lived together, particularly before being married, and some of them even after being married, okay? And they engaged in joint work contracts, and you see them standing up for one another in court. But some 15 to 18 years after building their own livelihoods, the Scots face a new conflict. In 1675, King Philip's War breaks out in Massachusetts. And on one side of the conflict were the Wampanoags, led by Metacom and King Philip, and their allies, the Nipmucks, Pocumtucks, and Narragansetts. On the other were the English and their allies, the Mohegan, Pequot, Massachusetts, and Nauset peoples. It's not a strictly ethnic war. But in large part, I think the issue behind this conflict was land, okay? The natives, particularly the Wampanoags, felt that they were being systematically fenced out of and otherwise removed from lands that had been theirs for millennia. There was a huge influx of English people, particularly in the area of Boston and towards the South Shore where the Wampanoags lived, and they just felt they were getting squeezed out. And they would take their cases to English courts, and guess what would happen? They would lose, right? So war broke out over some of these issues. And like all other able-bodied men, the former Scottish prisoners were required to join local militias and fight alongside the English. Now, this is probably at least the third war that they've experienced during their lifetimes. Okay. And many of the Scots lived and served on the front lines of this war. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. Swansea in Plymouth Colony was where the fighting first broke out. And former Dunbar prisoner William Colquhoun was one of the war's earliest casualties. Colquhoun had helped to found colonial settlements at Block Island and at Swansea. Now, John Wattles had been captured at the Battle of Worcester and sent to New England. And after servitude, he settled in Chelmsford. And although he died in King Philip's War, we know he did leave children behind. And how do we know this? Filmmaker Michael Moore, whom you may have heard of, is John Wattles' direct descendant. Okay. I didn't look that up or find it. Where I found it was I watched the PBS show Finding Your Roots. I don't know if you guys do, but that's where I found that fact. Okay. On the eastern frontier, Thomas Doughty and his family were burned out of their home and their mill in 1675, and they were forced to move in with two other former Scottish prisoners in Wells, Maine, because Wells was a little more secure. Okay. A treaty ultimately is signed in 1678, and people begin to feel more comfortable and more at ease. So many of them moved back, and this includes Thomas Doughty. Like many others, he returned from Wells to his former home in Saco and began to rebuild, and then actually began doing a really booming lumber business there at the Saco Falls. Many of you have been there. And we know that he was doing very well because he is among those who were taxed the highest among people who had sawmills at the time. But about a decade or so later, violence breaks out again. And King William's War pitted the English and their subjects, including the Scots, of course, against the French and the Wabanakis. And when I use the term Wabanakis, I'm referring to native communities in New Hampshire and Maine. And you can see from this map the orange areas where most of the Wabanaki French raids occurred. And you can see that Berwick, of course, is right in the center of this, right in the hot seat, right? As were most of the Scottish prisoners who had settled at Piscataqua. In 1690, Fort Loyal, which you can see on the map, that was Portland, okay? And it was destroyed. And all the English settlers in the area were taken out and shot. I'm not trying to say that the French and the Wabanakis were the only ones committing atrocities. They certainly were not. Okay, but I'm saying that they did have the upper hand for some time, because during this war, English settlements north of Wales were systematically wiped out, and they remained that way for 3 decades. So there really were no, the English were really forced to sort of retreat. Okay. Once again, the problem was land. In Maine, the English had signed a treaty at the end of the previous war saying they wouldn't expand their lands, right? They promised a lot of things and they never complied, right? They broke that promise. In addition, their cattle were getting loose. They were destroying the natives' corn and cultivated fields. And the natives were also upset because the English were placing large nets. In addition to having dams on the rivers, they were placing large nets at the mouths of rivers like the Saco, which meant what? It meant that none of the migrating fish, salmon, shad, herring, could get upstream where the natives could take advantage of them, because they depended heavily upon them for food and nutrition. Okay, so the natives said, the English are trying to starve us out. What are we going to do? So they said, well, we'll ally with the French, who treat us marginally better and who are engaged in a territorial struggle with the English. And so they attacked English settlements up and down the coast. Now, many Scottish prisoners, as well as others, died in these raids. Many were actually marched from Berwick, the Berwick area, all the way to Quebec as prisoners. Some of them died along the way. Some of them, once they got there, were eventually ransomed back, and some of them ended up staying there. Okay. Well, at this time, Thomas Doughty had a wife and 7 children. And they abandoned Maine completely for Salem, Massachusetts, leaving home, property, and livelihood behind. And they were joined by scores of refugees. And if you've read at all about Salem history, you'll know that the refugees streaming in and the constant dire reports of violence on the eastern frontier were key events that helped to precipitate the Salem witch crisis of 1692. So here again, at age 58, Thomas Doughty becomes a refugee, and he's forced to start life over. Now, the reason I really wanted to focus on his life was because here's a guy who's born in 1630 in very, very humble circumstances in Scotland. He was illiterate. Okay, he was probably born in rural Scotland and could not read or write. And one would think that this person would probably end up living out his life within a dozen miles of where he was born. But it's not true, right? The global age just kind of swept him up, and he was forced to immigrate 3,000 miles away because of war to America. Once he arrived here, war forced him to abandon his home and livelihood 2 more times. And economic concerns compelled him to move another 5 times. So it's an extremely tenuous, very insecure existence, okay? Now, I'm not going to tell you what happened to Thomas Doughty afterwards, because for those of you who haven't read my book, that would be a disincentive, and I would really like you to read it, okay? But I've tried to give you a flavor of the culture in which the Scottish prisoners lived and the obstacles that they were up against. And if you bear with me just another minute or two, I promise it will be very short. I'm going to give you a quick little tour of some places in New England that still speak to the presence of the Scottish prisoners. This one we've talked about, Saugus Ironworks National Historic Site, where more than 60 Scottish prisoners from the Battle of Dunbar were set to work. And you can visit this as I've done. If you're ever in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I recommend you take a walk in this cemetery, Mount Auburn Cemetery, because it's beautiful, quiet, rolling hills and mature trees. And you may come across this fence, and you can see it says, Scotch Charitable Society, Boston, AD 1657. So remember we talked about how the society provided for the burial of indigent Scots? Well, inside this fence are said to be buried 220 individuals without headstones or other markers. So this elegant fence really serves as their memorial, and I think it also serves as the memorial for the Scots' mutual support for one another. This is an operating inn in Durham, New Hampshire. And again, you can visit and stay there and have a meal there, as I've done. The original structure on this site was built as early as 1651, likely by Scottish prisoners from Dunbar, including Thomas Doughty. It was built as a home for their master, Valentine Hill. And the inn sits above the Oyster River, where Hill and his Scots built one of the earliest sawmills in New Hampshire. Those of you who live in Berwick have probably been by this house a number of times. It's one of the oldest houses in Maine, probably built around 1707 and used during the French and Indian Wars. The land, the first, shall we say, white man to probably own this, or at least the first Scot to own this, was Alexander Maxwell. He was the Dunbar prisoner that got into trouble with his master and was put in jail and was whipped. Well, he had a garrison on this site, and then he sold the land to John McIntyre, the son of another Scottish prisoner. And John McIntyre is believed to have built this garrison. And because of it, because of the settlement of numerous Scots in this part of York, the neighborhood became known as Scotland. Thomas Doughty, as I say, he's the central figure in my book, a Dunbar prisoner of war, built the original dam on the Great Works River here in North Berwick. And in fact, North Berwick itself was once known as Doughty Falls. Throughout Casco Bay, Maine, the Doughty name is very common. And I suspect that the vast majority of those people are direct descendants of Dunbar Scot Thomas Doughty. And it's interesting because many of his descendants also settled in Massachusetts, and they spell the name D-O-U-T-Y. And I'm not sure that any of them really know that the two sides of the family really know one another, really even were aware of one another for many, many generations. So that's it. That's what I've got for you this evening. I'll recommend a couple books, particularly the second one, really good reading. Seriously, the first one is really, really excellent too, and it goes into a lot more detail about the Scots individually than I do. So that's really worth your while too. So I want to thank everybody for putting up with me tonight, and I'd be really happy to answer your questions. And again, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Carol. Would you turn off the screen share? And then I think we'll be able to see the chat box again.
Yep.
Okay, great. And okay, so I see the chat box here. And see if people have some questions. Nothing yet. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and then we'll go through and answer them for you. Carol, would you be able to make me host again?
Oh, I'm not sure how to do that.
If you see up at the top, you can search for my name.
Yes, I see you. Okay.
And then when you scroll on that, it'll say something like more options, I think. Or more. It'll say mute and then more. And then when you click on more, it should say make host.
Got it. Try to make it. There we are. Yes. There you are.
Oh, very good. That'll just help me be able to unmute and turn people's cameras off if we need to. Okay. So there's a question here. What led you to explore this piece of history?
Okay, so that's an interesting one. Well, Thomas Doughty is my 8th great-grandfather. As I was looking through my background one time, I came across this fellow, and I read that there had been a group of prisoners who'd been sent to New England against their wills, and I couldn't believe it. You know, it was nothing I had ever been taught in school, and I just couldn't stop. I just had to keep finding out more and more. And I visited Scotland, and I visited Durham, and the more I saw, the more I thought, wow, there's a great, incredible story here. So it was really, really fulfilling, really interesting.
There's a question here that says, in Durham, there is a canal thought to be built for Valentine Hill tidal mills. Do you have any evidence for this?
I'm not aware of any canal there. No, I mean, the river, I'm just not sure. The river is right there. It runs right along the front of where Valentine Hill's home was and is. I mean, the piece that's still there was his home. So I can't really speak directly to a canal. I don't know that it's mentioned even in, I haven't seen it mentioned in any of the court or property issues that I've researched either. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but just that I don't have any information about it.
There's a question, did the Scottish prisoners' families in Scotland know what happened to their sons?
I don't know that we know that. We haven't found any evidence, neither me, but especially the scholars from Durham University. None of us that I am aware of have found any letters or any correspondence between here and Scotland. I think there was one, I know there was a guy, John Cotton, who was a Puritan reverend, and he wrote back to Cromwell telling him what had happened to some of the Scottish prisoners. But I don't know that the families actually corresponded with one another. There's really no evidence of me to say that. And that's really poignant. And in fact, what's really interesting is that when I went to Scotland, there was almost no knowledge whatsoever that any of these individuals had been shipped here. There was no record of it. There was no historical acknowledgement of it. And in fact, the Durham scholars were really interesting because they were saying that as they were unearthing the soldiers that had died at Durham, they weren't hearing very much from Scotland. They had a ton of email traffic from New England and North America. And that's because there were so many descendants over here who at least had an inkling of what had happened. But very few people in Scotland seem to have followed it.
Wow. Someone asked if the slides are contained in the book. The slides that you were sharing tonight, are they?
Most of them, no. Most of the book is not what I would call highly illustrated. There are a few of the photos in there that I took, and some maps. We do have quite a number of maps because I think that's really important to orient people.
There's a kind of a specific question about, says the great-grandfather is Duncan Stewart. Do you know anything about him or have suggestions where I might find information on him?
Wow, I really don't. So there are some individuals I know a little bit about because they were friends with Doughty. But I'll tell you, there are various ways to find out about the Scottish prisoners. I think one really good way is if you want to go back to Scotland and go to the website called Scotland's People. If there are records, it's probably within Scotland's People. Records often don't exist for members of poor families and didn't exist for Thomas Doughty. But I did find lots of records of other Doughtys, and I did find clusters of Doughtys in a certain area, which gave me some inkling about where probably Thomas Doughty came from. And then if you want to find out, depending upon how much you know, of course, the court records in New England, many of which still exist, are really terrific sources. Are, York County property records, which are still available. So those are sort of the main records that I use to dig up people.
There's a question saying Oliver Cromwell had a nephew in Dover whose name was Philip Cromwell. Do you know if he ended up with any of Oliver's prisoners?
Wow, I didn't even know that Philip Cromwell. I recall the name Philip Cromwell, and I did not know that it was the nephew of Oliver Cromwell. So I can't say much about that other than that I believe I've read that name either in court records or somewhere. So maybe there's a story there. There may be a book there, actually.
It says, has the spelling of Doughty changed over the years? You mentioned one spelling, I thought, right?
Wow. Yeah, that's a can of worms. Has it changed? it's unbelievable how many times it's changed and how difficult that makes research. I think I know that there were I've seen at least a dozen spellings of the name. You know, Doughty, T-Y-T-I-E, Doughty, Duty, Doughty, Duffy. I mean, it just goes on and on. And you have to look very carefully to be able to trace people, because of course spelling in the 17th century was not regularized. And of course, I mean, we all know Shakespeare spelled his own name differently depending upon the day, right? So it's very tough to look at the records. And in fact, I came upon some really critical records in Massachusetts under the name D-U-T-Y, which I would never associate with Doughty, right? But there he was, and I knew it was him because I could verify it through other factors. So yeah, changes a lot.
There's a question, were these Scottish soldiers volunteers or conscripted? Were they volunteers or were they forced into being soldiers?
Yeah, so the chances that they were volunteers are, well, it's hard to say. In some cases, poor people would join because it was basically getting free meals, right?
Mm-hmm.
But most of these regiments were mustered in local towns. So there would be like a lord or a person of stature in town who would be the one who would bring them together, and he'd be rewarded by becoming an officer, and he would persuade. And when I say persuade, I mean, you know, with all kinds of difficult persuasive tactics, so these people to join up. And it's sometimes we know that they were conscripted, you know, people went to get people and forced them, you know, grab them by the collar and force them into the army. That happened a lot. So it's hard to know. I think it was a variety of circumstances, but, you know, everything. They got soldiers in every way that they could. And many of the soldiers, there's even evidence of soldiers who knew that the conscription was coming and they ran away. They got into boats and they ran and you know, rode out to these islands or cliffs where they would stay hidden for a few days until as they call it, the storm had passed. So it wasn't necessarily everybody was super patriotic, though some were.
A couple of questions regarding the presentation itself. Yes, the presentation has been recorded. It takes a little while for it to download onto my computer and then for me to edit it and then upload it to Google Drive. So I usually do that in the morning. It takes a good half hour, 45 minutes for all of that to happen, but I will be posting it on the Old Berwick Historical Society website. It's right on the front page. We have a list of all the lectures we've been doing for the past year or so there where you can, anyone can access it. Oh, sorry, I just scrolled a little bit.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that little glitch in the beginning too. It just didn't, I couldn't forward my slide.
They want to know the best way to order your book. Would you type in the URL for ordering your book that is the best for you? Or is there a way that you benefit the most from purchases?
So here's how I benefit the most. And here's a lot of people benefit the most, and that is order it through your local bookstore. The books are available, they're out there. So my local bookstore, it's called Maine Coast Bookshop, right? Mm-hmm. And they've been really good about keeping it in stock. Mm-hmm. And they can get it within maybe a week or so. Okay, so that's one way I would do it. You know, you can order it through Amazon, you can order it through Barnes and Noble, you can order it through the publisher Westholme Publishing. And you'll find it certainly on the internet. But I encourage you, just for the support of local bookstores, to try that route if you can.
Did any of the prisoners establish a Presbyterian church in the area?
Well, I'm not sure that they did, because I think it was illegal, right? You had to go to the Puritan church. Maine, until I think it was 1658, at least, was under Massachusetts control, actually longer than that. So it really didn't have controls of its own. It was really seen as a Puritan state, and you pretty much had to go to the Puritan meeting house. And in fact, many of the prisoners are actually punished for not showing up at church from time to time. Okay, it doesn't mean that they didn't worship on their own, apart, in secrecy, but it probably would have had to have been that way. Or they were very tough. Let me say the Puritans were extremely tough if you were a Quaker, for example, and they abused the Quakers. And so it was really tough to be, the religious freedom was not really a thing on the frontier at this period of time.
Yeah, someone was asking this very similar question, just how surprising it is that there's no Presbyterian churches, and saying it's still curious about the religious legacy left behind by the POWs.
Yeah, because they just weren't permitted to. Okay, so New England was very, very tough on other. They had a lot of schisms within the Puritan Church, and some of those individuals had to move away. So we know of Roger Williams, who had to move down to Rhode Island, and there's a fellow named Wheelwright who had to move up to New Hampshire, and they were dissenters, from the Puritans, and they were sort of tolerated, but the fact of the matter is there wasn't a lot of toleration for other religions. Sects.
I think that's it for questions. A lot of compliments for a wonderful lecture and people sharing their background of their ancestors. I think I got everyone's questions, though. If I miss anyone's question, feel free to type it in. And then
Yeah, I'll say one last thing, just for a couple of resources. For any of you who are interested in this topic and you don't know the Scottish Prisoners of War Society website, I would send you there, because there's a lot of individuals sharing their genealogical research on that site. Okay, so I believe it's scottishprisonersofwar.com or .org, excuse me. Okay, so that's one place I would definitely send you. And of course, you can always, I have a website too, so you can always check out my website. It's carolgardnerwriter.com for updates on events and things like that. But again, thanks so much to the Old Berwick Historical Society and you, Carrie, and
thank you.
everybody who came out. I really appreciate it.
Can you say the title of your book again one more time, and I can type it in for everyone? Someone was asking for the exact title.
Yes, it's The Involuntary American, A Scottish Prisoner's Journey to the New World.